So good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Neville, and I'm a retired Detective Chief Inspector from New Scotland Yard. I'm fascinated by the history of crime, and this book is the result of that. And so if we look at Masonic links to crime for good and bad, I'm not here to just tell you scandalous stories. I'm going to tell you stories of good Freemasons and bad Freemasons, and you can make your mind up. But if we go back to the very start of the police in London in 1829, there wasn't a detective department until 1842 when somebody tried to assassinate Queen Victoria. But here's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Freemason from Southsea in Hampshire, and the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. But where did he get his ideas? Well, it's believed that he copied the ideas from this man here. This is Dick Tanner. Dick Tanner was the first famous detective at Scotland Yard, the first man to have the suffix of his name of the yard. So in the press, he was Tanner of the Yard. And Tanner was a Freemason. He was a member of the Dramatic Lodge in London. And he had to solve crime, as it says, by intuition and hunches, that just like Sherlock Holmes, because in the 1860s, there was no fingerprints, not until 1902, no DNA, not until 1988, no CCTV, none of the crime fighting methods that the police use. And what made him famous was the very first murder on a train, which he solved. Now, this is Mr. Briggs here, who was 70 years old, a Lancastrian like me. He wasn't a Freemason, but he was one of the very first commuters, and he was you used to get a train from Fenchurch Street. If you use an English Monopoly set, you'll remember that. He used to go to Hackney, which then was nice, now a bit of a dump. But he got on his train, and he was a first-class traveller, as he was a banker. And this is the first-class carriage here. Very nice and much better than what we travel in today. But whilst it's luxurious, it's also a prison, because once you're in there, you are locked in until the next station. So if you got in with a murderer or a killer, you were there and stuck. And what happened was, joined in that carriage by this man, Franz Muller, a German. Is any German Masons on tonight? This is a baddie from Germany. So Franz Muller isn't a Mason, thankfully. He attacked Mr. Briggs, battered him, stole his hat, stole his gold watch, and you can see what the crime scene looked like there. Of course, in this day and age, you could do DNA and fingerprints, nothing that could be done there. And Mr. Briggs was flung out onto the track. They found him, took him to this pub, which still exists today, but he died shortly afterwards. And Muller fled. Muller went to the port of London and got on a sailing ship bound for New York, and off he sailed. Wind of this disappearance got through to Brother Tanner, Detective Inspector Tanner, and he got his good sergeant, Sergeant Clark, who's also a Freemason from the Dramatic Lodge, and they decided to pursue him across the Atlantic. They've got the two witnesses. I think they were voluntold rather than volunteered to go, but they took them up to Liverpool, and they got on a steamship bound for New York. So now we have this bizarre transatlantic police chase where it can't communicate. This isn't like the Crippen case, it's before then. So the two ships cannot communicate. The ship, Tanner's ship with his sergeant and two witnesses arrive in New York some 6 weeks before the suspect. But this is a strange time to arrive in New York for a British police officer, because it's 1864 and we're in the middle of the Civil War, and of course the German immigrant community tried to support Muller and say that the British are supporting the Confederacy, so all extradition treaties are off. But as it is, when they sail eventually 6 weeks later, Muller arrives. He's grabbed on the deck and he's put into an identification parade by the New York Police Department, and the two British witnesses pick him out and they search his belongings and find the hat and the gold watch. So it's pretty conclusive evidence. But the court hearing went ahead, and the extradition warrant was granted by Abraham Lincoln, and Brother Tanner brought Muller back to Britain, where he was hanged at Newgate. If you know where the Old Bailey is, they used to hang people in public there. His judge was the Sir Frederick Pollen, of course, a Mason. So he was hanged by a Mason. He allegedly made his confession on the gallows, but apparently it's in German. But you can see there that the public executions in Britain didn't end until 1868. So that's the end of him. But there are consequences to this case. So whenever you're on a train, you'll see a consequence of Brother Tanner's successful investigation. And it's this, the communication card. This was introduced after the murder of Mr. Briggs, and as a result of Brother Tanner catching Muller. And this is the grave of Brother Tanner. I found it in Winchester. You can see here the inspector in the Metropolitan Detective Police Force. And there was an article saying how wonderful that there was a Jewish brother in the Jewish brother in the Metropolitan Police as an inspector in the 1860s. Of course, it's nothing to do with him being Jewish. He was the MEZ of his chapter when he died. And there we are. But moving ahead to possibly the most famous case. Now, again, if you invite me again, I can give you a 45-minute talk on this case. I can tell you about 60 Freemasons from 40 lodges involved in this case as both suspects, as witnesses, as detectives, as coroners, and whatever else. But I'm just going to give you a flavour, because if there's anything that that Freemason will be called into, it's the Jack the Ripper case. Now, if you read that book on the left, if you've seen Johnny Depp's film, we won't make any more, I don't suppose, but if you see From Hell, the story is this, that the provincial Grand Master of Berkshire, that's Prince Albert Victor, who's the son of the Grand Master, then the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, and he's the grandson of Queen Victoria. He allegedly married a Catholic woman, which was contrary to the law of England, and he had a child, and the prostitutes who were killed knew about it, attempted blackmail, and there was a Masonic conspiracy to bump them off. Now, let me go through this so I can show you the facts behind this. Now, as it is, in 1888, when this happened, they really don't even know how many murders occurred. There may have been 13, there may have been 4. These are the ones that they think are down to Jack the Ripper at the moment. Look at number 4, Eddowes. I'll bring that up in a short while. But they go from the end of August to the day of the Lord Mayor's show. But let me give you a flavour of some of the Masons involved. Certainly, Right Worshipful Brother Charles Warren, who was a commissioner of the police. Now, I saw a Gibraltar lodge come up as we linked in. He was a member of, he was initiated in Gibraltar. He was the district Grand Master in Singapore. So he's certainly a Mason, and he's in charge of Metropolitan Police. The coroner for at least 3 of the victims was Wyn Baxter, Sussex and London Mason, who roundly criticised the police and called them bungling and stupid, which they possibly were. So the idea there's a Masonic conspiracy is a nonsense, even with him. And the Lord Mayor on the day of the final death, De Keyser, was a Belgian and also a Freemason in London. And so was this man, Mr. Lusk, because 2 weeks after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, a letter arrived at his shop. And Mr. Lusk was the chairman of what was called the Vigilance Committee. They were civilians who used to go patrol and see if they could catch Jack the Ripper. And you can see the letter is addressed From Hell. This is where the Johnny Depp film gets its title. And it says, "Dear Mr. Lusk, here's half a kidney, other half I ate and fried." So this letter to me is living proof that Jack the Ripper is not a Mason, because, of course, Mr. Lusk was Brother Lusk of the Doric Lodge. And surely if Jack the Ripper was writing to a Brother Mason, he would have said, "Yours sincerely and fraternally, Jack the Ripper." He's certainly not a secretary, because he would have probably put, "And you can't have a meal unless you book one." But moving on. So here's the facts that I've found. I have located, as I say, 60 Masons involved in this case. And of the 60 Masons, in 40 lodges, does that mean a Masonic conspiracy? Or is it just a reflection of Victorian society where lots of men were Masons? Probably the latter. And you may have heard in the press in the last 4 or 5 years that the case has been solved, because this man here is a Scottish Freemason. This is Donald Swanson, a Scottish Craft Mason and a London Mark Mason. And he was what would be called today a Detective Chief Inspector, like I was. He was again, a modern phrase, the senior investigating officer for the case. He was at Scotland Yard. Everything that came through about the investigation went through him. When he retired, the assistant commissioner wrote a book about London's crime, and in the book he said this: unsolved murders in London are very rare, and Jack the Ripper is not in this category. So what's he saying? He's saying it's been solved, but he said, I cannot name the killer. Now, a copy of that book was presented to Brother Swanson. Brother Swanson kept it, and it was in his family for 100 years. Now, 100 years later, his great-grandson was flicking through the pages, and he saw a entry where it said, I cannot name the killer. Brother Swanson had written in pencil, Kosminski was the suspect. So who was Kosminski? Aaron Kosminski was a local Polish Jew, a man of no consequence, okay? And what I'd like you to think about, in 1888, how did the police solve crime? Well, as I've said, there's no fingerprints, no DNA, no CCTV, my specialism. They did have photography, but of course, if you caught Jack the Ripper, you'd have to say, can you stand still for 20 minutes? Well, he's not going to do that. But they did have detectives who they could follow him around. And they followed, Freemason, Willie Clarkson from the Drury Lane Lodge, obviously theatre, he disguised the detectives. They followed Kosminski around for 3 days. And every day they found him masturbating in public. Now, in England, I don't know about anywhere else, that's a crime. So don't do it if you are doing it. But jokes aside, he was mad. So there's nothing they could do with him. And they locked him away and he died in an asylum in Hertfordshire. Now, that shawl in the middle is alleged to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes, the victim. And on it, they say they found blood, which matches a descendant of Catherine Eddowes today, and a semen, which is said to belong to the DNA match to some of Kosminski's relatives that are alive today. So it sounds pretty conclusive, but it's only a 1 in 10,000 match. If I dealt with murders, it would be 1 in a billion. But if it has been solved, the case of Jack the Ripper, it was solved by a brother Freemason, Donald Swanson, top detective in his day. But moving on to possibly what's the most famous case, which people quote. And this is the story of the man who made Masonic signs at the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey is the most famous court in England. On here is, on the left, is Brother Frederick Seddon. Now, he is from Liverpool. Now, I'm from Manchester, so I know that he must have been a bad person, because I don't know if there's any Scousers on here, but we can debate with them. I can debate this with them later. But so Brother Seddon, he's a Lancashire Mason. He comes down, he's a Buckinghamshire Mason, and he settles in London, and he's quite a greedy man. He's an insurance man. He likes gold coins, likes lots of money. He lives in the house you can see next to him in North London. And he falls in with this woman, Eliza Barrow, who's on the spinster on the right, who owns the Buck's Head pub. So if you come to London, Camden Market, it's there today. She had she owned the shop next door and the gold coins. And Seddon said to her, look, you've got a lot to worry about here, pub, a shop, money. Why don't you come and live in my house? We'll feed you every day. We'll give you an allowance every week, and we'll look after you for as long as you live. And of course, in true Edwardian style, or Georgian style, this is not going to be very long at all, because he buys some fly paper and he extracts from that fly paper arsenic, which he puts into the medicine jar you can see on the right, Valentine's meat juice, and he gives her one massive dose of arsenic. Now, if you're thinking of bumping off the wife, this is not the way to do it. This is highly suspicious. I'll show you the right way to do it in a minute, okay? But this is the wrong way to do it because it's very bad. He gives her one dose and she kills her, and within he buries her in a pauper's grave, and within 1 week, the relatives are knocking at the door saying, what about the shop and the gold? It all belongs to, no, it belongs to me. Get lost. So they're not happy with this. They go to Scotland Yard. The Scotland Yard call in Dr. William Willcox, who you can see on the left, and Dr. Bernard Spilsbury in the centre. These are the two most eminent pathologists of the day, and both are Freemasons. It was Spilsbury who proved the case against Crippen, and Willcox was the man who designed the test to show that blood was human. So they both made significant advances. Most of the most famous cases in the 20th century involving crime involved Spilsbury, who developed the way that the police deal with murders in a forensic way. So if you like Quincy, Silent Witness, CSI. He is the original one of them, and he was a Grand Officer in Craft, Chapter, and Mark. But what they do, they exhume Eliza Barrow's body, examine it, and quickly show that she's riddled with arsenic. So the scene is now set. So the Seddon, the brother Seddon, is in the dock of the Old Bailey, accused of murder, and the judge presiding is His Honour Sir Thomas Bucknell. That's Right Worshipful Brother Sir Thomas Bucknell, the Provincial Grand Master of Surrey. So the scene is now set, and the trial goes on, and he is found guilty. And this picture, this photograph is unique. They think it was taken by a lady with a camera hidden in her hat, because you're not allowed to take photographs in British courts. And if we look at the photograph quickly, on the left, we can see Seddon's bald head in the dock. On the right, we can see the judge, Right Worshipful Brother Bucknell, and behind him is the chaplain, and he's just put on his head the black cap, which was the moment that the judge in England sentenced somebody to death. And as judges say, Right Worshipful Bucknell said to him, "Have you anything to say that will prevent me pronouncing the sentence of death?" And this is what Seddon did, according to the Old Bailey records. "By the great architect of the universe, I am not guilty of this crime." And the judge, he was taken aback. He was fairly shocked by this. And but this is what he said: "Our brotherhood does not encourage crime. It condemns it," and sentenced him to death. So he did the right thing. Of course, the hangman said, "Step off of the left foot." But that, I made that bit up. That's just a silly story that people tell, because no hangmen were ever Freemasons, strange enough. But what's tragic about this case is at Scotland Yard, there's a letter from Bucknell to a friend. And I've identified that friend as a brother Freemason. And in it, he says he has been criticised by brother Masons for what he did, hanging the man. I think he did the right thing. And do you remember I said at the start about good stories? Well, if anybody ever challenges you, or Masons get away with things at court, you can say, "Do you know the story of Brother Seddon and Brother Bucknell?" But moving on to possibly one of the most English murders that you'll ever get. And this involves Brother Major Herbert Armstrong, who was a solicitor in a place called Hay-on-Wye, which is on the Welsh-English border. And you can see he's a small, sort of weedy man, really. And my experience of the police tells me that small, weedy men usually get married to big, strapping women. And this large lady he was married to was rather a bully, really, and she would check all his letters and all that. And he escaped the first time into the First World War, where he was in the reserves or the Territorial Army, and that's why he's a major, and he had quite a good time in France. When he finished there, he came back, and his wife was at him again. So he used to escape to the garden, and he was quite pedantic. He didn't like dandelions. So he went down the street to the chemist and bought from a brother in his lodge in the chemist shop some arsenic, which he put into a squirt gun and squirted the dandelion flowers and weeds and killed them off. But this is not all he did. He kept some of the arsenic back. And you remember I said at the start about how to do this thing properly if you're considering such wickedness. He just put a tiny bit of arsenic in his wife's food every day. Just a tiny bit. So his wife went a little bit mad, and then more mad, and then totally mad. But of course, with women, sometimes this is difficult to tell, isn't it? And then she died. And no one suspected a thing. And everybody felt sorry for him and said, "It's just a terrible business. You know, he's a widow, he's got no children, he's got children, and he's on his own." But all it did to Brother Armstrong was to embolden him, because now he thinks, "I've got away with it. I've got away with murder." And he thinks to himself, there are two solicitors on Hay-on-Wye, and it'd be far better for business if there was only one. Now, this, brethren, is, I personally feel, where he crosses the line, because it's one thing, isn't it, to bump off the wife, but to bump off a brother Mason is just an outrage. But he sets about doing it. So he sends, the first thing he did to try and murder his other solicitor is he sent a box of chocolates to the other address. Everybody ate them, and all violently ill but not dead. When they actually opened them up, every chocolate had a little hole in the bottom which matched the dandelion skirt. Having failed in this endeavour, he now tries the most English way of murder. He invites the other solicitor to afternoon tea, and the murder weapon of choice is an arsenic-laden scone, which you can see the cakes on the right. And the famous phrase was, excused fingers as he politely passed the arsenic-laden scone to the solicitor who ate it, who was violently ill, but didn't die. He fled for his life, and the local police called Scotland Yard in. That's the original New Scotland Yard. You can see it on the right then. And who did they call in? Brother Spilsbury and Brother Willcox, the pathologist. They exhumed the wife's body. She's been dead several years, but she's skeleton is riddled with arsenic. They find arsenic in the crumbs of the scone which was eaten. They examine the chocolate box, and he's arrested by a detective sergeant in his own lodge. And they find arsenic in his pocket. So it's pretty damning stuff. Some people have said the man's innocent. It seems pretty conclusive to me. But he was hanged. And in fact, the foreman of the jury, the man who stood up and said, guilty, was also a member of his lodge. So there's about 10 Masons involved in that tale, and only one of them is a baddie. But moving on to a scandalous case, really. I don't know if any of you have been shocked by things like in England, the scandals of Jimmy Savile, Cyril Smith, where the establishment covered up. This is a scandalous tale of the murder of the Grand Master of England, the 10th Duke of Devonshire. The 10th Duke of Devonshire was a very influential man. He was on Churchill's cabinet in the war. His sister, who you can see, Lady Dorothy in the right, she was married to Macmillan, who was then the Prime Minister of Great Britain. His son was engaged to JFK's sister, very powerful. The Dukes of Devonshire have a beautiful home in Derbyshire, which you can see centre bottom. And they don't have a holiday home in Eastbourne, which is the seaside town you can see top in centre top. They actually own Eastbourne. The entire town belongs to them. It was a bad place to have a heart attack, which the Duke did in 1950, because the GP was one Dr. Bodkin Adams, who is not a Freemason, thankfully, who probably murdered 250 to 300 elderly people, generally old ladies, by putting them to sleep, basically, with heroin. We also killed the Grand Master and other men. But in the wills, he was left very nice with these people. Left him. It was left 2 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost cars, vast amounts of money, and he lived in this 17-bedroom house, which still exists today. And then this carried on until he was brought to trial and got off. So how did he get away with all this? Well, the case, the person who made the decision, again, is not a Freemason, is Manningham Buller, bottom left, who was the Attorney General. And he had to select the case. In the 50s, you could only be tried for one murder at a time. He picked a case where there was no body, where it had been cremated, where all sorts of evidence was missing, all sorts of things started going to the defence that shouldn't have gone there. So why is he doing all this? Well, the National Health Service in Britain was only a few years old. And the last thing the government really wanted was a doctor hanging from the end of a rope. The BMA is the British Medical Association, the Doctors Association. They sort of conspired with it and said, we can't give evidence because it's patient confidentiality, which was nonsense because all the people were dead. The homosexual police chief in Eastbourne didn't want any trouble either, because this was the 1950s and not today. He was kept his mouth shut. And the Attorney General well knew that the Duke's sister, Lady Dorothy, you can see there with the Prime Minister, was actually having sex regularly with Lord Boothby. He was a sort of a character for the British establishment. And the net result of all this is that he not guilty. The moment he was found not guilty, he was handed a letter saying he couldn't be tried again. And the question is, why did he kill the Grand Master? So if you look at the old ladies, you can say there's an element of greed, getting their money. But what they found with the case of Dr. Shipman, who in the 90s and killed around 250 old ladies in Britain, there was a power thing, really, that I decide who lives and dies. But also, Bodkin Adams, the doctor, was a member of a thing called the Plymouth Brethren. And if you go onto their website today, it says things like the Freemasons are the devil and all this stuff. So is that why he killed him? But what I would suggest to you, if anybody suggests that Freemasonry is all powerful, well, if you can murder the Grand Master and walk away with a not guilty, we can't be that powerful at all. But that's a tragic case, and it was our Grand Master who was the victim of this wickedness. But you'll be pleased to know that in 1963, when the Great Train Robbery happened in England, none of the villains were Freemasons. But let's come on to the goodies involved. So the plan, the post office in England had a train post office, which they used to fill full of money in Scotland and move very slowly through the night. And as it was a public holiday, a bank holiday, they filled it with 5 times as much money and moved it slowly through the night. And the villains, the criminals from South London, had a great plan. They just put a red signal in the middle of nowhere in Buckinghamshire, stopped the train, and the job of a man called Ronnie Biggs, who was one of the robbers, was to recruit a train driver to move the train a mile forward to the bridge you can see so they could offload the money. Now, he failed. He recruited somebody who could drive Thomas the Tank Engine, and in the end, they had to hit the driver, whack the driver, which no people likes violence, but they moved the train forward and offloaded about the equivalent of £30 million in cash down the embankment into our, and 17 miles away, they hid at that farm, Leatherslade Farm. They had so much cash, they were playing Monopoly with real money. That Monopoly set is there in the centre. I've actually handled that Monopoly set. But the second mistake, they thought the police was onto them and they fled. They left the farm and they didn't burn it down. So the farm is full of fingerprints. Now, a young officer called John Woolley, who's an Oxfordshire Freemason, was the first to turn up. He said it was rather like the Royal Arch. He was in an empty house. He found a trap door. He went downstairs and he couldn't see anything, but he felt something. But when he came back up, it wasn't a scroll of vellum or parchment. It was a post office money bag. So that's how they knew that the villains had been there. The fingerprint expert was called in from the yard, quickly identified many of the villains, and they were arrested, as you can see on the right. And Ronnie Biggs, though, he jumped over the wall. Having been arrested, he jumped over that wall at Wandsworth Prison onto that furniture van, and then went to Paris, where he had his face plastic surgery, and then he went to Australia, and then he fled. We know he went to Rio, where he was there, and he was with the Sex Pistols, and also he was a thorn in the British establishment side for many years because he wouldn't leave Rio. They wouldn't extradite him to us. But so no one in the 70s, no one knows where he is. And so officers from Scotland Yard were sent all over the world. And one chap, Brian Marshall, Detective Sergeant Brian Marshall, was a Gloucestershire Freemason, and his job was to go to Rio. And he said to me, look, you go abroad with the police. I was on my own, so I got my flight tickets and I went to after Scotland Yard, I walked up to Grand Lodge and I said, is there a lodge in Rio de Janeiro I can go? And he said, oh, yes, there is. It's full of expats. Here's the information. So he went to Rio. He made investigations, didn't get anywhere. So he went to the lodge meeting. And at the lodge meeting, he said at the festive board, has anybody seen anybody new in town, English? And a guy there said, yes, one of the brethren said, there's a bloke called Michael who does odd jobs as a carpenter. So he, DS Marshall, Brother Marshall, arranged a meeting by the cafe, by the great statue of Christ, the Redeemer. And when he saw him coming up the hill, he thought, well, it does look like Biggs, but bear in mind, we know he's had plastic surgery. He didn't know that. So they had a cup of tea together and discussed some fictitious work. And when the man called Biggs left, Brother Marshall took the cup and saucer he'd used and stushed it into his bag. He then ran down the hill. The British Embassy flew it to Heathrow. It was then couriered to the yard, and the fingerprint officer said it was Ronnie Biggs who had his hands on that cup and saucer. So it was information gained at the festive board that found Ronnie Biggs in Rio. And if you think you've had good conversations, that's probably the best of them all, isn't it? But moving on to these two, the Cray twins. They're infamous gangsters. If you're from Britain, you'll know them. They're all over films and all that. The question is, because they're on the front cover of my book, look, because everybody likes to hear about the Cray twins. The question is, were they Masons? Well, I can tell you, no, they weren't. But then again, I think there's a place for everybody in Freemasonry. Charity steward and treasurer, probably. They do well to collect all the fees. No one would be behind if they were in charge. But they weren't Freemasons, so definitely. Now, Ronnie, who you can see at the front, in the foreground, he was completely mad. He was a psychotic. He shot George Carnell in the face in the Blind Beggar pub, which you can see on the right, still on Whitechapel Road today. And his half-sane brother, Reg, he stabbed to death a man called Jack the Hat McVitie in a flat in East London. But what's the Masonic connection? It's a good one. They were captured by a Freemason, Brother Nipper Reed. He was one of the top detectives. He was a Mason at the time of this investigation. A lovely man. He died. A lovely obituary about him in the Daily Telegraph. I had the pleasure of meeting him, but he was the man who caught the Cratons. And if any of you have seen films about the Cratons where they're being rude to him and mouthing off, he said they were never like that. They always referred to him as Mr. Reed. And I went to see Nipper at his lodge, and I said, Nipper, you've been in this lodge for 50 years. Why have you never been the master? And he said, oh, I think it would have been hard work. And I said, Nipper, catching the Cratons must have been harder work than being the master. But there we are. A lovely man, and very sad to see him die last year. But here's a tale of some Masonic stupidity, really. So, or Masonic criminality. So, Worshipful Brother Lenny Gibson was the master of a lodge at Southgate, Waterways. You can see Southgate bottom right. And in 1980, with two brothers called the Agudas, who were members of a lodge, the Ilford Lodge at Clerkenwell, they did an armed robbery on a contingent of silver bullion bound for East Germany. One of them dressed up as a sort of a road inspector, MOT inspector, waved in the truck you can see, and then they pulled out the shooters, the guns, and the shotguns, and robbed more than about £40 million worth of bullion. What's crazy about this is that everybody involved thinks there's a Masonic conspiracy. The bottom left picture is a detective who was on sick but running marathons. He was convinced the Masons weren't promoting him in the police, but then when he arrested one of the criminals and said, "Where's the loot? Where's the silver?" He thought he was the police officers in the same lodge as the criminal, so he wouldn't tell them. So there's two bizarre Masonic conspiracies going on, and neither is true. Eventually, though, brothers Gibson and the Agudas were arrested and sent to 10 years in prison for armed robbery. But the lodge had an unusual solution to this. In England, it made them country members and paid their fees. So when they got released, they came back. This is why now in England, especially, we have anybody who's found guilty of a criminal offence is thrown out, and that's the finish of them, gone. And it's the same with this man here on the left, Kenneth Noy, very wicked man. If you go on to Google, let me give you, this is important. It's all about facts. As a detective, I dealt with facts. If you go on to Google and put Kenneth Noy Freemason, it will tell you that he was joined a lot. He was proposed and seconded into a lodge by corrupt detectives. He ran a gold smuggling enterprise in the lodge, and all this. It's rubbish. He was not even a steward, and there was not really. There is a sort of tinker tailor and candlestick maker in the lodge. In 1983, there was a very massive robbery on the Brinks depot near Heathrow Airport. And the criminals expected to find lots of cash, but they found £26 million in gold, really. And what can they do with it? Noy was what we call in England a fence. He was a man who got rid of it. In the course of the investigation, he stabbed to death the man on the right, Detective Constable John Fordham. He somehow got away with that murder. The jury found him not guilty, but the judge, Aguda, who was a Freemason, gave him 14 years for VAT fraud, tax fraud, like Al Capone. He then came out, killed another young lad on the M25 in a road rage attack, and eventually he was arrested in Spain. When he was brought back to England, he gave the DCI from the flying squad a Masonic handshake, but it really brought him down, and they used it against him. But he's a warning to us all, brethren, about who do you bring into Freemason. Here's possibly the most, my title of my book includes the word skullduggery, and here is some, scandal. Here is some skullduggery. So in June of '82, there was a postman walked along under Blackfriars Bridge on the city side, which is where you can see St. Paul's Cathedral, and there was a body swinging with bricks and dollars in the pocket. Who was it? Of course, Roberto Calvi. Roberto Calvi ran a bank in Milan, and he was a member of the P2 Propagandae Due Lodge. In his bank, he controlled money for the mafia, the Vatican, and the members of his lodge, which consisted apparently of South American dictators and an Italian fascist. I think in United Grand Lodge of England, I think it'd be called the Special Interest Lodge. Not one I'd care to visit myself. But the question is, so when his bank collapsed, Calvi sort of fled. His secretary jumped out the window, as you do, and he fled, and he ended up in England in a sort of James Bond type way with speedboats and hovercrafts and the like. And eventually he was found hanged. So who killed him? Was it the mafia? Or was it the Vatican? Or was it the Masons? Well, on this one, I think we're in the clear because if you look at the members of P2 Lodge, it had people like Berlusconi in it. I mean, who could believe he'd be involved in any skulduggery at all? But there we are. So that's Brother Calvin. And some of you are old enough might remember this chap here. This is PJ Proby, who used to split his trousers on the stage, singer from Texas originally, but made a Freemason bizarrely in West Bromwich near Birmingham, and he was charged with fraud. But what caught my eye is that every time he appeared at court, he wore his Grand Lodge tie, if you notice there. But he got a not guilty. But there we are. So in conclusion, there's some people, if I give this to 100 people, one person will say, oh, no, you shouldn't talk about these things. But every organisations have bad people. And now a ritual, if you're an English Mason, there's your first degree tracing board. And it says that those 4 tassels represents prudence, fortitude, temperance and justice, all of which virtues, it says, were practiced by the great majority of ancient Freemasons. Not all, great majority, because as our ritual tells us, 3 murdered the Grand Master and 12 had a good think about it. So the ritual acknowledges there were 15 bad Masons before it ever started. So we can be honest about every big organisation, whether it's the Scouts, the Catholic Church, London clubs or anything, we can always find individuals who are not good. But so we have to acknowledge that Noy was a Mason and Seddon and this lunatic Breivik. I went out to Norway to assist the Norwegian police after that incident, but he was immediately flung out. He'd only been to 4 meetings. But for every one of those, there are lots of good men. And this is Jim Morrison here. Brother Jim Morrison was a Scotsman, but he was an East End detective, and he was in Covent Garden waiting for his wife, you can see on the left, just before Christmas, and he saw a bag thief. He could have ignored it, but he didn't. He chased him, and he was found dead. This is his plaque. Just near the Indian Embassy at the Old Witch, if you're in London at that place. That's a Mason there, and no one's ever been convicted of that murder. Tragedy. Finally, it was a Mason who helped solve all these riots in London. That was me. But here I am, a less successful case. So if any of you old chaps were there at the time, you can ring up Crime Stoppers and top up your pension. But there you are. If you want to come to London, I'll take you round, and I'll take off my sound now, so I can answer any questions.
Mike, thank you once again for joining us today and giving us such a wonderful talk. Would you like to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. We very factual, very detailed, Mike, and we expected no less. So thank you so much. I know it's difficult for you to get everything or the essence of everything you've written down in a talk that's only 45 minutes, but we really appreciate your time. We're going to go straight to questions. So we've got Paul Greek. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Amit. Hi, Mike. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Paul.
And as a former magistrate, and a member of the disciplinary panel.
Right. Okay.
I see these things, and it's quite right. If Masons commit crimes, they should be punished for it. Talking about Calvi and the P2, yeah. I attended a lecture by somebody who was talking all about that, and he said that the P2 wasn't a Freemasons lodge; it was a Catholic type of equivalent lodge. There wasn't anything to do with actually mainstream Freemasonry.
So you've gone off, Paul. You muted yourself.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, what I was saying was that I was at a lecture and somebody was talking about the P2 lodge, and it apparently it wasn't a mainstream Freemasons lodge. It was an organisation that was a Catholic type connected with the Vatican.
Right. Well, my research has shown that whilst it was odd and people could just become members without doing anything, at the time it was the Grand Lodge was recognised, and members of P2 could have visited an English lodge. That's what's in my book, and that's my research. So whilst it might have been a bizarre setup, it certainly wasn't a lodge as we would recognise it. It was, by virtue of being in a certain Grand Lodge, they could have visited English lodges.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Next, could we go to Mitchell Warner? Hi, Mitchell.
Hi. My question, going back to the murder from the Civil War, how is it that the English were able to gain an extradition order from Abraham Lincoln when the Union thought the British were supporting the Confederacy?
Well, your word "thought" is probably it, because it was never officially declared. Because the big fear of the Union was that France and Britain would join the war on the side of the Confederates, but there was never any official declaration, and so that's why it was. So whilst there were suspicions that things were being sold to the Confederates, there was never any official agreements. And so under international law, Britain was neutral, and we had these agreements, extradition agreements. And it's amazing when you think 1864, the cooperation that occurred between the NYPD and the Metropolitan Police. Absolutely amazing. Are you down in Australia, yeah?
Yeah.
So one of the classic cases is Frederick Deeming, who was a Mason in New South Wales. He's a Jack the Ripper suspect. He was found. He did a murder in Christmas Day, I think, 1891. But the police in Australia communicated with the New Scotland Yard by telegraph, and then they telegraphed the Lancashire police, and they found extra bodies in Lancashire. So it's amazing how the police cooperated. All those, you'd think it wouldn't happen, but it does.
Thank you.
No problems.
Lovely. Thanks, Mitchell. Next, could we go to Rob Crawford? Hello, Rob.
Hi, Amy. Hi, Mike. Good
Hello.
to hear. I've heard you talk previously, but this was a little longer and a little bit more in depth, which was very good. Have you? I know you've spoken about a number of these cases that have happened. Do you have any? Are there any additional ones on the back burner that you're looking to investigate or to look at further?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots. I mean, I could talk. I do a talk on the development of forensic science, for example. So the very first fingerprint case. Which the very first fingerprint expert at the Yard, Charles Collins, was the master of his lodge at the time. Proved the first murder in 1905 in London. The Brides in the Bath case, Crippen. Those two were investigated by Spilsbury and Freemasons and Masons, who were detectives as well. And at the moment, I've just been looking into a chap called Henry Wainwright, who was the member of Victoria Lodge in London. And he was the very first Whitechapel murderer. So there's a debate whether Jack the Ripper was the Whitechapel murderer who's a Mason. Well, Wainwright, who was 14 years before him, certainly was a Mason. And he sort of bumped off his lover, shot her, buried her in a shallow grave in his factory. And when a year later it all went wrong, he had to dig her up and chop her up. And as he was moving her into the cab, one of his servants saw like a hand and chased him through the city until the police caught up with him and said, stop, and they found the body. What was fascinating about that case, the chief inspector, again, was a Mason charged with the search, and the doctor, and they looked at the hair on the axe and the hair on the skull and compared them. In 1865, that must have been some of the very first use of a microscope for forensic purposes. So that, yeah, there's nearly every famous case, I'll find a Mason for you in it somewhere along the line.
Excellent, great. Cheers, Mike. Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Rob. I'm sure we can find a few in Spain as well.
I'm not more than likely, yes.
Next, could we go to John McKinnon, please? John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Lord Lucan a Mason?
No, Lord Lucan wasn't a Mason. Oddly enough, one of the people who helped him get out of the country was the 11th Duke of Devonshire, the son of the murdered Grand Master I spoke about. What is interesting about Lord Lucan, though, is his son is a Mason. And so at Grand Lodge, when he was made, when they announced all the Grand Stewards, somebody read out Lord Lucan, and everybody's looking round, but it wasn't the Lord Lucan who you perceived it to be. It was his son. Why on earth anybody would want that name? God only knows. But no, Lord Lucan wasn't a Mason. Sorry, no.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got to go tonight. Thank you once again for everything.
Thanks,
thank
John.
you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Good night.
Next,
Good
could
night.
we go
Cheers.
to Conor McBreen? Hi, Conor.
Good evening. Thank you for the talk. It was great to get a balanced approach and a balanced view of these stories
Thank
that
you.
grips the nation at times. I'm interested to know, because you were in the force, whether all of this skulduggery and all these stories, especially the ones that were portrayed within Martin Short's Inside the Brotherhood and the Brotherhood book in the 90s that saw a massive decline in Masonry, did you ever have any negative effects within the force? And do you think that the police force will overcome this, these, you know, what the public might think, or will they always be looking over their shoulder if they want to join?
I don't know. It changed when I was in the police. So when I joined the Metropolitan Police in say '89. Before that, I think it would have helped if you were in the sort of '70s. It might have assisted a little bit, maybe. By the time I joined, then this letter came out saying, you know, we had to declare, are you a Mason? When the new Labour government came in, Jack Straw was the Home Secretary. I think we had these letters saying, you had to fill in this form. Are you a Mason? I am a Mason. I am not a Mason. I am not prepared to say if I'm a Mason or not. But within about, and a lady deputy assistant commissioner was put in charge, so they couldn't say that it was, you know, it was skullduggerous in any way. Within a month, there had been a court case in Italy where an Italian county court tried to force people to name themselves as Masons. It was declared illegal under European human rights, so that was all destroyed. And then they went through like a Mason hunting period, and then it's turned into ambivalence now. They don't care. And I can honestly say of the top 40 officers at Scotland Yard, those who are of sort of commander rank and above, not one of them is a Freemason. And why is it? Well, they've definitely got rid of people like me who are ex-army, and hardly any of the top people are ex-army or ex-forces, because they're the sort of people who join Masonry. You know, they're more interested in they're university students. So it's the sort of nature of the people that's taken. So it made no difference to me in the end, but I don't think it'll ever be like it was before. And just as an example, Conor, that there's only 6 members of Parliament who are Freemasons, apparently. The same thing. It would be a better place if there was 300 Masons in there, but there we go. So that's my personal. So no, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Conor.
Brilliant.
Next, could we go to Tony Fellows, please? Hi, Tony.
Oh, hang on. Sorry, I was muted. Hi, Amy.
Hello,
Thank you
Tony.
very much.
Hello there.
Yeah, Mike. Very fascinating talk. A question for you, not exactly Masonry. You described the very early history of New Scotland Yard and how police changed.
Yeah.
Obviously, you were in, and we know now it's very, very technical. If you had a chance, would you be where you were at your peak now, or would you like to go back to the Victorian era when it started?
Well, I had a good career, really, you know, because I developed this, if you look it up on the internet, human super recognizers. So it's wonderful to be able to do something where people all around the world copy it, you know. So what I set up at Scotland Yard is now in Australia, in Germany, and maybe the States. And so on a personal level, I really enjoyed that. And the other thing I had in the police is you could actually laugh about things and have a bit of humour. You know, it's a sort of back end of life on Mars, I suppose, when I first joined. But yes, I think the probably 60s catching the Cray twins or the Great Train Robbers must have been great fun, mustn't it, really? Because I suppose you could get away with more things then. But no, I had a good career on it, so I can't complain.
And you're going to keep on doing this?
Yeah. I was teaching police today. I ran an online course for Thames Valley Police today, so the work goes on. So,
excellent, good.
Still catching villains.
Thank you very much.
Tony. Next, could we go to Brian Gent? Hi, Brian.
You're on mute, Brian.
Trying to get off it. Yes, I've done it. Yeah, thank you very much. Can I just go back to Mike? Can I say thank you very much for a super talk? But can I go back to a little bit about ex-coppers and what it was like being coppers? I joined police in 1960.
Right.
So I have a little bit of knowledge of what it was like in the 60s, 70s. And I'd been pretty rapid promotion in those days, and I got to be inspector. I got to be inspector in about 13 years, and I then joined Freemasonry. And the night before I joined, I had a telephone call from a superintendent from a different division to say, if you join Freemasonry, you'll never get any further.
Right.
So 13 years later, I retired, still an inspector.
Yeah. Where was that? Which force was that, Brian?
Sorry?
Which force was that, Brian?
That was, it started off with East Riding. It would, at that time, it would be Humberside in those days.
Humberside, okay.
When I got the Gypsies warning. But yeah, anybody who thinks that it's a passport to success, my success was all pre-Masonry.
Yeah, no. Thank you.
A wonderful career, though. Thank you very much, and thank you for tonight's talk.
Cheers, Brian. Smashing to. I'm a West Yorkshire Freemason, to my eternal shame, because I'm really Lancastrian.
Thank you, Brian. And next, could we go to Brother Sotrius? Hi, Sotrius. You are not on mute, but you've got no sound.
You got no sounds.
No. You can hear us, we can't hear you. You want to log out and back in again? Okay.
Very well acted. I admire your lip reading skills, mate. Very good.
Mike, we've got some really, really great senior brethren in the lodge, my Mother Craft Lodge. A few of them, bless them, they're short of hearing, so we've learned a bit of lip reading from them. Right. But fascinating talk, Mike. We'll wait for him to come back on. Yeah. I don't think there's any other questions, brethren. If you do have any other questions, please come forward. Mike, so after the book or this novel that you've written, are they in succession? Have you done them in succession?
Yeah. The Sacred Secret one was first, and then I did this. I should write. I'm writing another one really if I can get my backside in gear. All around, people like this Wainwright. I found out that the latest thing, because I was walking around the East End, so I found where the Cray twins lived, where Wainwright's murder was. But I also established that the doctor, Treves, who looked after the Elephant Man in the Royal London Hospital, was also a Mason.
Really?
He really looked after him when other people have been quite cruel. So it's there's a nice story there, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've got some more questions coming. Jim Young. Brother Jim?
Good evening, a lovely, interesting talk. I used to work with the chief prosecution witness at the great train robbery, John Maris, who was actually milking his cows as the lorries came down to Leatherstone Farm with all the money. He was very disappointed when he reported it, that there was very little done for several days before they actually went down to Leatherstone Farm, by which time they'd gone. And by the way, Leatherstone Farm was also gone because the tourists were down there all the time. Up until recently, so they knocked the house down and got rid of it.
Yeah.
And John Maris spent the next several months being pursued by all sorts of people. Fortunately, he kept a diary of these events, and when he presented at court, a diary apparently is considered to be the best kind of evidence to present to the court. And they were very disappointed with what happened to him as the potential prosecution witness.
Thank you, Jim. We've got to Mike. We've got a few minutes left. He's back on, so we'll go to him and we'll try him one more time. Sotrius, are you on?
Yes. Am I audible?
You are indeed. Yeah.
Excellent, Brother Mike. Thank you so much. It was an amazing talk, and it really gives a lot of different perspective on crime and Freemasonry. Naturally, the P2 case. It's obviously the mob and not us, but that's one of the most interesting cases I'd like to delve into. So I think the books definitely do. A thing that your talk got me thinking into was my interview from back before I got initiated. I was asked whether Freemasonry is going to help me in my professional life, and I was like, well, you know what? It depends. I mean, Freemasonry is like a magnifying glass. It can either help or destroy you. And now I'm not taking this professionally per se. I'm taking this in your life as a whole, as a more holistic approach. Our brethren are there. They see us. If they know we're Masons and we mess up, then it's going to show. And it's going to be entirely our fault and our responsibility. And Freemasonry does teach us responsibility. If we're good at something, we're going to bond with our brethren, and we're going to have a great time, and it's going to help us as people to evolve.
I'm going to move my computer because my wife's going to do something in a minute. She's doing some fitness training, so I'm just going to move around the house.
Yeah, I hear you. Mine's yelling downstairs because you just put the kids to bed. Yeah.
I'm moving around the house right now. So
no worries. Anyways, what I was meaning to say is that this thing that happened to the brother that called on the great architect of the universe. To the judge.
Yeah,
that was, not only was it out of line, that was the judge made the perfect call. I mean,
absolutely,
no Mason in his right mind and on the square should judge that or second doubt it or second guess it or whatever.
Agreed.
It was a great talk, and it just took me all the way back 16 years ago when I had that question asked in my interview, and it was exactly that thing. It's everything, goes as above, so below. Well, anything can be applied on a microcosmic level.
Where are you? Where are you
Athens, Greece.
But where are you from originally?
Athens, Greece.
You sound like an American to me.
I know, my English is as bad as my Greek. It sounded more English till I went to primary school. Okay. I mean, yeah. So sorry for the spelling.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you so much.
We've got 3 more questions. We'll try and wrap these up if we can. Next, can we go to Robert Rue, please? Hi, Robert.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Thank you very much for the great talk. Very interesting. I was a GP in Eastbourne from 1972.
Right.
And I was a police surgeon for 25 years from the same time. I met Bodkin Adams on several occasions.
Right.
And just as a comment, he had a very successful practice after his trial, and all the patients that he did have spoke very highly of him.
Yeah.
That apart, do you think that the prosecution just chose the wrong victim to prosecute him on?
I think so. That's but I think it was deliberate. I spoke to Nipper Reed, who was Nipper Reed he was a detective sergeant at the time, and he said that the detective superintendent Hannum, who got the case, he spoke to him and said, "I've been given a political hot potato." This was like, so they knew at the time there was sort of skullduggery going on. That was, the senior investigating officer knew it was bad. Right. So it was all a terrible conspiracy in my view.
Right. Thanks very much.
And it was interesting to speak to Nipper because he was telling me at first hand, he was there, listening to his boss telling him this was a bad move.
He was a strange man, was Dr. Bodkin Adams, I must admit. I found him very strange to talk to. Yeah.
But if we look at the case of Shipman, the man who arrested Dr. Shipman, the detective inspector, he was a Mason, but he was, of course, criticised. Everybody said, "Oh, you're picking on this man. He's lovely with his patients," and the community were against. There's police for arresting Shipman. It's incredible. You doctors, you see, everybody trusts you. You see.
I know, that's right.
Robert, thank you very much for that. Thanks for adding to it.
Thank you.
Next, could we go to Ewan? Hi, Ewan.
Hi again. It's Jekyll and Hyde. I don't know if you know anything about Deacon Brodie, who the whole story was really based upon, who was a member of Canongate Kilwinning No. 2 in Edinburgh.
Oh, okay.
He was the deacon of the local carpenters as well. He was a deacon of one of the trades in Edinburgh, and he made locks, and he then stole from people, and eventually got caught and hung on a gallows which was supposed to have been designed by himself. So in those days, you didn't have to expel anyone. they were just hung and they were out of the way anyway.
Right. Well, it's interesting with Wainwright. In the lodge record, the man who was hanged for chopping up his lover, the lodge record said he'd gone away.
And if you come to Edinburgh, you'll see in the High Street the Deacon Brodie pub, and that's supposed to be diagonally across from where he was actually hung. And one of the lodges in Edinburgh actually meets in his old house.
I mean, if you could, Ewan, if you could, I mean, my details have been on the screen, but please send me. I come up to Fife regularly to give lectures, so I do come to Scotland. And as Colonel Neville, I'm head of Army Cadet Music, so I've got my tam o' shanter because I'm in charge of the bagpipes. So I've got every reason to be in Scotland. So please send me some information, and we can put together a Scottish version.
Okay.
Well, you saw the good Scotsman, Donald Swanson, who probably solved the Jack the Ripper case.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ewan. Mike, before we go to our final question, which is going to be Derek, I'll announce you in a moment. Just a couple of things, Mike. If you could stay on afterwards, because Mahir and I need to speak to you.
Yeah.
And secondly, your book, globally available through what medium?
Well, you can buy it from Amazon, but I've got copies here. Please buy it from me, because if you get it from Amazon, I get about 10 pence, I think. So, and I can send you the ideal Christmas gift. So when your wife says, "What do you want for Christmas?" and as a bloke you say, "I don't know," you can say, "I want a copy of Crime and the Craft," and I can sign it. And look at that! What a wonderful gift! Yeah, so get it from me. But you can buy it on Amazon. But yeah,
and if they were to buy it from you, Mike, is that via a website or email?
Email. So
okay. What I'll do,
email.
if it's okay with you, I'll post your email
Absolutely.
address. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Derek, thanks for your patience. You're on now, but you're on mute, so you'll have to take yourself off mute.
Right, I'm down in Dorset.
Hello. I'm in New Milton, not far away.
Oh, right. Well, interesting in your talks. My wife is working her way through this book. Did you ever come across a thing called Operation Countryman?
Yes. So of course it was your chief constable in Dorset. He was an ex-Marines officer, Burt, wasn't it? I think he was in charge of that.
No, it was Len Burt, no relation.
Yeah,
but he was the assistant chief constable. He was on the square.
Yes.
And the chief constable at the time was Hambledon, and he was also on the square. But I couldn't remember what dates or when Operation Countryman took place. But I know between you and me and these four walls, I think the Metropolitan Police gave Len a bit of a hard time.
Derek, if you read the book, it's in there. There's a whole chapter on it.
Oh, is there?
Yes, in that book. They're all mentioned.
On the Masonic, the Crime and the
It's got all
Craft.
their lodges listed. Because as I say, Burt was he's a brave man. He was been a Royal Marines Major who won a military cross in the war. And there's a very good interview with him on YouTube on World in Action where he says that his duty is to the public, not to anything else, not to the police or Freemason or anything like that. It's very good.
Yeah, well, he belonged to a lodge in Poole in Dorset.
Yeah.
But he's passed away now. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mick, for bringing me in.
Oh,
But
Derek,
again, it
thank
was
you very much.
Another splendid evening.
Thank you very much. Brethren, well, that we call it time now. What is the time? It's 7:10 almost. A very, very big thank you to you all for joining us here today. We really do appreciate the time you guys take out every week on a Tuesday without fail. It's great to see so many wonderfully familiar faces and new ones on here as well today. Thank you all once again. We are delighted to welcome next week very excellent Sir Knight Richard James Goodwin, who will be giving us an insight into the order of the Knight Masons. Same time, same place, 6 o'clock next Tuesday. There's nothing more for me to say then other than good night,